Welcome to everyone for joining us to the ISTR webinar with Professor Trish Reid, who is just the most wonderful guest, and we are delighted she found time for us. Trish is Professor of Theatre and Performance and Head of the School of Arts and Communication Design at the University of Reading. She's the author of many things, including Theatre and Scotland, published in 2013, The Theatre of Anthony Neilson from 2017, and most recently, Theatre and Performance in Contemporary Scotland from 2024. I don't know if anyone can see me, but I'm holding the book right now, and it's fantastic. She has published widely on contemporary British theatre and its engagement with politics in the broadest sense, and she's recently been elected to the Executive Committee of the International Federation of Theatre Research and is a member of the Advisory Board of Theatre Research International. With Liz Tomlin, Trish is General Editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Elements in Theatre Performance and the Political, and with Claire Cochrane, Catherine Hindson and Lynette Goddard of the Routledge Companion to 20th-Century Theatre. And both projects seek purposefully to expand and diversify the historical record through engagement with diverse performance histories and intellectual traditions. And very importantly, Trish is from Glasgow. And also importantly, which I've just been learning, Trish used to be in a couple of bands, and we might squeeze a bit of that out of her before our time is up today. So we want to have a lovely chat, particularly about this new publication, which is incredibly insightful about the momentum behind Scottish theatre and performance, particularly since 1999 and devolution, those connections between restoring a nation and cultural production, and the endless battle of public subsidy and funding for theatre and the instability of it. And how our theatre and performance traditions, exist within theatre buildings and plays and playwrights, but also exist beyond them, and how we can hold those sort of complexities together and celebrate them. So on that, Trish, I'm going to hand over to yourself. You can chat for a bit and open it up. We can start. If you let us know what suits you, we'll work to that. And thanks a million.
Thanks very much, Miriam. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm most honoured. Of course, my grandmother was born in... That's not true. I was going to say my grandmother was born in Dundalk, but she wasn't. She was born in the Gorbals 6 months after our family emigrated from Dundalk. So, but yeah, so I'm very honoured.
There's a link.
Honoured to be invited. There's a definite link. Yeah, really. So what I thought I would do is just kind of like just sort of run through. I've got some nice images. I always think nice images are a good thing. These are the ones that are in the book. And I thought I would sort of run through sort of what the book covers really, and sort of just talk a bit about sort of what my thinking was in relation to the project. And then you can please feel free to interrupt me if you've got any questions. And Miriam, maybe for the beginning part of it, and then hopefully we can open it up for questions and have a good chat about it. Yeah, so I mean, as you know, I've been writing about Scottish theatre for quite some time, like since 2007 really. And the book is a sort of the combination sort of really of quite a lot of thinking, a lot of different bits and pieces of writing that I've been doing about contemporary Scotland and about performance and theatre in that kind of space really. And most of you will know that Scotland has kind of been has undergone quite a period of change in the past 50 years really, and that's particularly kind of like been accelerated by the referendum that happened in 1997 in the immediate aftermath of the election of the new Labour government. Seems like a different world now. And one of the things that was in their manifesto was that they would have devolution referenda in Scotland and Wales, and of course the Good Friday Agreement was part of the Good Friday Agreement was the establishment of an assembly in Northern Ireland, which is not obviously, it's kind of a bit of an on-off thing, sadly. But that the establishment of the Parliament really, and the kind of a cultural and political kind of force of that, the kind of like of the period before that really sort of, I think, underwrote a real bounce of cultural confidence in Scotland and all things Scottish really. And this is one of the things I think that has been reflected and inflected through in Scotland's kind of theatre culture really. So the book looks at all those things. It looks at the kind of context of Scottish politics, of the rise of Scottish nationalism, if you like. And really one of the main stories of Scotland in recent decades is the transformation of the Scottish National Party, the SNP, from really a fringe party of sort of, kilt wearing, shortbread eating, sort of Tory types, to this kind of mainstream party of the centre left, like an actual political force in Scotland. And this happened really very rapidly and quite surprisingly, I think. So I mean, I often say that like in 2015, when in the UK general election, when Labour lost almost all of its seats in Scotland, I think it went down to 5 or 6 seats in Scotland, like my father, who died quite young, nothing to do with the drinking and the smoking, but he he wouldn't have believed that was possible. He was a Glaswegian who would never have believed that it was possible that Glasgow could lose, that the Labour Party could lose Glasgow. So it has been quite a time, really. So what I do in the book is I sort of look back at the first part of the book. I look back mostly to the 70s briefly, but mostly to the 1980s and 90s, to think about the sort of contexts and the kind of practices that underwrote this kind of renaissance, if you want to use that word, in Scottish theatre that sort of really came into its fuller flowering in the early part of this century, really. So, and I make an argument that it's useful to think of Scottish theatre and the theatre community as a kind of epistemic community. I mean, like Ireland, I think any community or arts community in Scotland is quite small because it's a small country. So it's very possible and indeed likely that most of the main movers and shakers in that culture will know each other and will sort of have worked together. So one of the things that I do in my opening chapter is I look at the production, I think it's 2017, I might be getting that date wrong, there was an adaptation that was done of a stage adaptation of the very, very famous and influential Alistair Gray novel Lanark, which was published at the very beginning of the 1980s. And that production, which I talk about in some detail, the book was adapted by David Gregg. The show was directed by Graham Eatoff, who was also a founding member of the performance company Suspect Culture that David Gregg worked with. And the actors featured Sandy Grierson played the central figure of Lanark, and Duncan Thaw. I don't know if you're familiar with Alistair Gray's book, but it's an amazing book and I recommend it to everyone. Sandy Grierson's a Scottish actor very strongly associated with Vanishing Point. So those sort of kind of like visual, physical theatre company, which is very strongly influenced by European traditions. And then the cast included like a number of actors, like included Jerry Mulgrew, who was one of the founding members of the Scottish theatre company Communicado, who in the 80s and 90s had again developed a really kind of distinctive brand of ensemble kind of playing and very famous translations of European classics into Scots. So most famously, the very famous Edwin Morgan, who was at that Glaswegian poet, a very famous translation of Cyrano de Bergerac into Scots, which was massively successful, and that was kind of one of the things that Communicado had done. So these people had sort of all come together to make a show of this book. And this book also had become very emblematic of this thing I'm talking about, of a sort of renaissance in Scottish culture, because one of the things that happened in Scotland, of course, immediately before that was the election and imposition of a Tory government in 1979, the Tory government led by Margaret Thatcher. And that could have been that year. There was that happened that year, and also there was a failure of an earlier referendum to establish a Scottish Assembly that didn't reach the kind of threshold for participation, although a majority of the people who voted for an assembly. So those things kind of combined to make people feel that the 80s might be a particularly depressing time in Scotland. But actually what happened was a sort of opposite thing, which was that it sort of kind of really precipitated a kind of flowering, really, of Scottish culture again. So Alistair Gray is a key figure in that, but also another key figure is the mighty James Kelman. And the kind of like, there's a kind of real resurgence in Scottish literature and this idea that like for Kelman in particular, that the Scots language, and in his case particularly Glaswegian, working class Glaswegian Scots, which is the version of Scots that I would have grown up speaking, was a viable and indeed a rich kind of like mode for expression. And so really what happened was that Scotland just kind of like in response to the political situation in England, and I should say Thatcher was like a real hate figure in Scotland, a real like Scotland across a lot of different political shades really never took to that whole project and really just rejected it. So by the time you get to 1997, there are no Tory MPs in Scotland, none. So we used to say there are more pandas in Scotland than Tory MPs because there were two at Edinburgh Zoo during that period. But so really, and then I think that's like kind of a sign of that. And in the book, I sort of use this as context. It's a sign of how, real sign of how Scotland and England are on two different political paths. And this is kind of what leads to not just to devolution, but to the kind of independence referendum in 2014. This just real sense that Scotland has not voted, hasn't had a majority for Conservatives since the 1950s. So that's like 70 years ago. And so people are now like, what are we doing? We keep getting these governments and we haven't voted for them. So it's not a thing really. So yeah, and then I talk a little bit as well about in that first opening chapter about some of the kind of companies and practices in Scotland that really, with the benefit of hindsight, had really instrumental in the kind of re-theatricalisation of Scottish culture. So I talk particularly about the Glasgow Citizens, like in the period when I was at school there, where they were doing this kind of like under, the co-artistic directorship of Giles Havergal, Philip Prowse, Robert David MacDonald, who was a translator and playwright. They did this kind of really wild sort of like auteur-led kind of design-led kind of classical European repertoire, which like nobody else was doing in the UK really. And they were doing it in the Gorbals. They had this kind of like radically democratic pricing policy, but this kind of like really sort of high art experimental approach to theatre. So I think that I talk about how I think their work really did contribute to a sort of like theatricalisation of a re-theatricalisation of Scottish culture. And then I also talk about the Traverse in the 1980s and how, actually under quite a lot of financial pressure, there was a sort of new generation of Scottish playwrights who are still working in Scotland who sort of emerged. Other people have written about this as well, Miriam, particularly the Traverse in 1985, which saw the kind of emergence of playwrights like Peter Arnott, who is still a very established, important Scottish playwright. Chris Hannon, whose play Elizabeth Gordon Quinn is a kind of really kind of famous and effective rewrite of the sort of classic Glasgow tenement play, because Glasgow has this tradition in tenement plays. Like I'm thinking some of you might know the Ina Lawrence Stewart's famous Glasgow Unity play, Men Should Weep. And it's sort of like, which is about sort of life in the Glasgow tenement, really. So Chris Hannon makes this kind of like quite a really interesting intervention in that tradition. And also the third figure who emerges in that season is Jo Clifford, who continues to work both as a translator. She has most recently, I think, her version of Calderon's Life is a Dream won a lot of awards in Scotland a couple of years ago at the Lyceum. And then of course Jo Clifford has another life as a kind of a trans performer and playwright, and has had a big impact not just in Scotland but internationally on in that space of trans performance. So I'm thinking of things like The Gospel According to Jesus, Queen of Heaven. I don't know if anyone's come across that
I
work,
wish
which
I
is
had.
really, yeah, it's really amazing, which I write about a bit later on in the book, where Joe sort of kind of performs a sort of a ritual where trans experience is kind of written into the gospel, which is it's a really amazing, and that has also been translated into Portuguese and has had quite significant success in Brazil. Um,
Can I
so
ask Trish,
yeah,
just if we're doing a stop start and just to let other people
yeah.
know
No,
we are
good.
as well,
That's good. Yeah,
and because people might want to put up their hands or something, and
yeah.
then we can let them in.
Hmm.
But it just seems like there's such rich activity even through the 70s and 80s. It
Yeah.
seems, and maybe this is just because how we're looking at it in terms of the cultural context and everything Scotland
Mhm.
is going through, but it seems very inherently connected with the nationalist dialogues
Yeah.
that have occurred. But yet Scotland is quite diverse. So like there's Scots, Gaelic,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
how many languages are there? Because
I
we
mean, I
tend to
think
think like people
officially
Irish.
that there are three. I mean, I believe like officially there are three. So there's English, Standard English, and then there's Scots, which is a number of different kind of iterations of Standard English, but which are quite regional. So there is a language that we would call Doric, which is a language that's kind of spoken in northeastern Scotland, which you might see in the work of like some of the younger playwrights. There's a really great bunch of young women playwrights from Aberdeenshire actually who use that mode. And then of course there's Gaelic, which is the kind of indigenous language mostly of the West and the
Mm.
Hebrides, the islands, yeah. So I would say that definitely, and I'm sure this is similar in Ireland, that and indeed in Northern Ireland, that it's not possible for a playwright to. Language is always a political issue in Scotland, so the choice of the language that's used is always political, really. It's never
Yeah,
there's no such thing as kind of neutral in that
no,
sense. Yeah,
no. And
yeah,
with the growth, when you were saying of a sort of a confidence about Scottishness
yeah.
and post-devolution, was there an uptake in those languages then in the art forms and theatre and performance or other
Yes, and
forms?
yes, that's partly, I think, supported by the fact that the government, the Scottish National Government, the SNP government have put Scots on into the schools. So so it becomes something that can be taught that's taught in the schools, and it's a mode that through which.
على طول
Hmm?
That was
Was
something
that
else I didn't hear
somebody
exactly.
else? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think there'll be like engagement in the schools with poetry and Scots. So I mean, obviously Burns is the most famous of that of them example of that. But yeah, and I think that's right. I think there has been an increase in confidence around kind of expression, cultural expression, and language is a very important aspect of that. Yeah.
And not to try and compare it to sort of the changes in Irish theatre, because I know there's different things impacting us both, but I think in a lot of 20th century Irish theatre, there was a huge focus on the dramatist and the play, the
Yeah.
three actor or the two actor. Um,
Aye.
and, a lot of scholars would have said not a confidence or not really an encouragement of any sort of embodied expression or centering of the body or embodied performance or European traditions. Um,
Hmm.
but then once we get into the 21st century, it seems like that changes. And there's a
Yes.
kind of a whole opening up of performance practices, not a
Yeah.
lessening of playwriting,
No,
just an
no.
opening up and more space and maybe more audiences for other paradigms. So is there any sort of similar trajectory
I
there?
think so. I think there is as well. I think there is. I mean, I think that there's a certain amount of like, I mean, and not all scholars of Scottish theatre would agree with me, but I think that in the past there's been quite a lot of energy or some energy that's been misplaced in trying to sort of like establishing a kind of coherent tradition in Scottish playwriting and the way you describe it, that sort of, that is kind of centuries old, if you like. And I
Mm,
think that one of the impetus for that is our larger southern neighbour, if you like.
yeah.
And I just think you're on a hiding to nothing because I do think that like England has got this extraordinary tradition in playwriting that starts in the 1590s and is only really interrupted during the interregnum. You know, so really, like, I don't really see much point in trying to sort of compete with that. Oh, but we had 18th century playwrights, or, you know, we had whatever. But I think that certainly, I mean, I think certainly one of the things that I've tried to do in the book is to try and capture the kind of diversity of practice, and not focus solely, or even not have the majority of my focus on plays and playwriting in that kind of conventional, traditional sense. So I've tried to focus on things. I've given, I think, more space than you would, I mean, I would argue that you would usually find in an account of Scottish theatre, contemporary Scottish theatre, giving more space to things like, you know, site-specific work, or the performance companies, or actually, one of the things that I think is missing from most kind of general accounts of Scottish theatre is the centrality of Scotland in the 21st century, and particularly Glasgow, to live art and performance art, which you don't really see in. Glasgow was the location for and the host of the live art, you know, the National Review of Live Art for years. You know, so at the CCA, at the Arches, and it has these ongoing performance art festivals. Take Me Somewhere is the obvious example. And Steve Greer, who's at Glasgow, is doing a really brilliant AHRC funded project on the history of live art and performance art in Scotland. So that, and you can get that to that through the website, but you can see that there's just been this very lively tradition for a long time that's never really properly been, I think, incorporated into accounts. And then similarly, I think there's I know there is a very strong tradition in theatre for children and young audiences in Scotland. And I've tried to give adequate space to that, because I think it is a really important part of the sector, and it's really important work. And that's been done through a number of really great, excellent companies that some of you will have heard of. So, you know, Catherine Wales, Visible Fictions, the Polar Bears. I don't know if you've seen Ivor McCaskill's The Polar Bears Go Wild, Starcatchers, and also principally through the great work of Tony Reiki and the started in as the International Children's Festival, but then became Imaginate, which still runs. And Imaginate just became this kind of central force in bringing international work in that space to Scotland, and then also sending Scottish companies out to international stages. So there's quite a number of productions that have been really kind of internationally acclaimed in that space, and particularly for theatre for young audiences. So I think all that work's really interesting. I'm trying to think what else. And then also I think like you know, there's been a lot of stuff that's been done outside the central belt as well. So Scotland's got a very oddly dispersed population. It's got a very small population, and most of it's concentrated, about 70% of it's concentrated in what we would describe as the central belt. So the Highlands are really, really mostly wilderness. Yeah. So so that idea of getting out there to try and make theatre with communities, but also to take work to those communities. And I talk a bit in the book about how that model for touring work to the Highlands and Islands was really consolidated in the famous 784 Scotland production, The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil. So ever since the year of the Cheviot, which is like 1973, when they toured, you know, whatever it was, like 30 venues, and only 5 of them were actual theatres. There's been an expectation in Scotland around where the work should go, and also who is the legitimate audience for the theatre. So I think I think that's been quite an important thing as well. I'll see if I can move it on to some other images.
Yeah, but has Scotland been a bit of a leader in terms of kind of questioning place and audiences, just with the National Theatre of Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, I mean, these images are these are the images that are in the book. This is the fabulous Joyce Faulkner in a National Theatre of Scotland revival of Liz Lochhead's The Mary Queen of Scots Got Her Head Chopped Off, which is a very kind of famous feminist revisionist history play from the 1980s. And I think you can see the legacy of Liz's work into the present time with these great revisionist history plays that, for example, Rona Munro has written. Yeah. I mean, Rona Munro's been a great kind of exponent of the feminist revisionist history play. A play like The Last Witch. I don't know if you're familiar with that play, which is about the last woman to be burnt at the stake in Scotland. Scotland was big into burning women. I'm sorry to tell you that, but
Yeah,
Scotland and
that's true.
Germany, like the places where the Reformation was at its most kind of I don't know what the word is, assertive. I've got the worst track record in that space. So yeah. And then this is I maybe go back to that. So yeah, I mean, I think just coming forward to what you're saying about the National Theatre of Scotland, I mean, I've written about that in other contexts as well. It's a very interesting story. It's a very interesting idea, this idea of a sort of buildingless national theatre, and it's proved to be really successful, I think, and against a lot of the criteria that it sort of set up itself to be kind of judged by, if you like. So really what happened was that if people aren't familiar with this story, was really what happened was that once the Scottish Parliament was established in 1999, the first Scottish executive, which was a Labour majority executive, had accepted in principle that the idea that Scotland should have its own national theatre, but it did not specify the form that that theatre should take. And it set up a Scottish Arts Council working group, which working group drew substantially on an earlier report that had been produced by the Federation for Scottish Theatre under the chairmanship of Hamish Glenn, who was at that time the artistic director at Dundee Rep. And that particular Federation of Scottish Theatre report had recommended that the new national company should be buildingless and that it should create work in collaboration with and partnership with artists and existing companies in Scotland, in and around Scotland. And so basically the Scottish Government accepted that as the model. So really what you have is a very unusual moment where you have like actual consensus where the Scottish theatre community sort of more or less gets what it asks for.
It's radical, I think.
It's radical, and it's never, and I think it's radical because of what I was just saying about earlier on about the just because of this kind of like understanding that the population is so dispersed. And also, I think some people felt that there would be a big like hoo-ha between like if you were going to build a building, where would it be? Glasgow? Would it be Edinburgh? There'd be a big massive hoo-ha. And then there was this feeling of dread from some quarters that like they would launch it with some kind of like mad like, production of King Lear with Sean Connery in it or something. It would all just be so hideous. Everyone would just want to kill themselves.
But still go see it though.
But they did completely avoid that. And I mean, personally, I think that Vicky Featherstone, who was the inaugural artistic director of the National Theatre of Scotland, was an extraordinary, did an extraordinary job, really. So
does that mean then if the National Theatre of Scotland makes productions in partnership with artists or other companies, so then automatically the funding that gets associated to the National Theatre becomes dispersed?
Yes, I mean, there are arguments, and I don't go into them too much in the book. There are arguments about how well it's dispersed and how far it's dispersed and how it might be. I mean, there's never going to be, I mean, I'm sure it's the same in Ireland and anywhere else. There's never enough money for the arts. And so there's always going to be people saying, oh, we should put more money here and less money there and all that. But for
No,
sure,
but we have a national theatre that is in Dublin that gets half the theatre budget. And the other half
I mean, I don't think that's, I mean, so I think that like there's a number of things. I mean, in the first production that they did, the first work that they made was in February 2006. So it's nearly 20 years ago now. And they launched with this project, which was called Home. And it was what they did was over one weekend in February, they made 10 different productions, all on the theme of home in 10 different locations across Scotland. And these productions were led by established Scottish theatre artists, and by Scottish theatre artists I mean theatre artists who had worked substantially in Scotland, and they were all made on this theme of home, and the other instruction was that they shouldn't be made in conventional venues. So over that weekend, it launched with like Home Glasgow, Home Stornoway, Home Shetland, Home Caithness, Home Dumfries, Home Edinburgh, Home, so all over the country. And I mean, I just think I've written about this again in other places, but I think it was just a really brilliant idea, because it's one of the things that it demonstrated was that Scotland, as I'm sure is the same with Ireland, the diversity of Scotland cannot be represented on one stage in Edinburgh. That's ridiculous, yeah. But also it meant that the kind of responsibility for the projects. So I remember having a conversation with the designer, Stuart Lang. I don't know if you know, he's quite a famous designer, and whose company, gosh, I can't remember, Untitled Projects, who made the piece that like I've got the image of here, which is a really brilliant piece called Paul Bright's Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Stuart made the Home Stornoway production, which was actually an installation. It was a model that people could look into and could listen to voices in English and also in Gaelic. But Stuart said that he would never have done it if he hadn't known that there were 9 other people doing it. If somebody had approached him and said, would you like to make the inaugural production of the National Theatre of Scotland? He would have said, no, thank you. I would not like to be that person. So I think it was interesting from that point of view. And then the other thing that was great about it was that it was actually physically impossible for one person to see all of them.
Okay.
So it also made it kind of like, so I guess I think that also sent a kind of like really positive signal that like the company wasn't going to try and like pretend that it could capture the whole of Scotland like in one, as I say, in one show really. So and then of course that year, I mean, I think that year 2006 was an extraordinarily successful year for that new company. Nobody would have expected the success that could have predicted it. So it included this project Home, and also at the Fringe that year it was the Summer of Black Watch, which turned into this kind of like huge international phenomenon, and sort of toured in 5 or 6 different productions and just kept going forever. And it sort of really mobilized the iconography of Scotland for international audiences. So the Scottish soldier, the pipes, the folk song, the martial tradition, all those things, yeah. So I often think they should just keep doing it as the actors get older and older. It'd be like that scene in Strindberg's A Dream Play, where remember that scene where the captain comes to the stage door and waits for the dancer to come down and she never comes, and he just keeps doing it and he just gets older and older, and the flowers get really, really rotten. They just get older and older and older and keep, So, but I mean, I think that production as well is also kind of quite pivotal, because I think it is, it kind of divided opinion. It was massively successful with audiences and also with critics all over the world. So there's all sorts of stuff where it won 22 different awards. It was, Ben Brantley in the New York Times, like, wrote about how he wept at the end. It was all this kind of stuff, And then there were other people that were going, it's a bit macho. It's all a bit like, oh, so, but I think it's sort of is emblematic of those kind of tensions that continue to kind of like run through Scottish culture, really, particularly around Scotland's complicity in, and complicity is not even the right word, participation in the crimes of empire. Because there are still some people today in Scotland who would like to pretend that Scotland was not a participant, that Scotland was a victim. And then there are other people like me and many other people who say, no, you can't, you're not getting away with that. That's not like, So it's kind of, I think there is a tension there still, and it's in that show. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it also modelled other things, that show. It models a kind of theatricality that is very popular theatricality that again borrows from some of the vocabulary of something like the Cheviot. Although, I mean, the Cheviot is ideologically sound and more rigorous, like by about 600% than Black Watch. But it does do these things. It has these three different kinds of scene. I don't know if there's a BBC film of it, which is really worth watching. It has some scenes that are based on interviews that Greg Burke, the playwright, did with former members of the Black Watch Regiment who had been on tour in Iraq. So those are kind of more verbatim scenes. It has some imagined scenes that are with the regiment in Iraq. But then there are also these kind of abstracted or kind of ahistorical interventions which are based on movement direction that Stephen Hoggett, who's one of the artistic directors of Frantic Assembly, did. And then also there's a lot of songs in it. So that's very Cheviot-y. Yeah, so that mixture of those kind of different modes. Yeah, there's direct address. There are bits where they directly quote from politicians at the time. So it's formally, it's very reminiscent of that, of the Cheviot, and I think it does establish that popular mode as a kind of a legitimate mode. And that's certainly carried on. The National Theatre of Scotland continues to make those kind of big, popular, populist shows.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going on about Black Watch too much.
No, we brought you here to talk about stuff in Scotland. That's what we wanted to hear. I wonder, does anyone else want to come in at this point? I know, I'd say you have a few more slides there, Trish, but just if someone wants to raise their hand or anything, just to let you know you're welcome, fire away if a thought comes to you, and I'll keep an eye on things. Otherwise, we can move on. Ooh, engaging audiences.
I mean, this is an image. This is from the chapter where I talk about like the way that a lot of practitioners have like worked really hard to expand the audience for theatre, both in the kind of community space and some of the bigger projects of the National Theatre of Scotland, where they'll do this stuff where they might they made a project on Shetland, on that archipelago, which was called Ignition, which was about the islanders' relationship with the car. And that, you know, these projects, they'll embed artists, but it will take them like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months to make these productions. And then the productions will be staged on it. That production was staged on Shetland, and it never toured. It was not made for other audiences. It was only made for so they had some great things there. They had like parkour, teenagers doing parkour performances, because obviously they're not allowed to drive yet, although they really do want a car. And like there's this great image of a kind of car cozy that one of the knitting circles had made. So that was a really interesting project. And I mean, there are many examples of the National Theatre of Scotland doing that, sort of going out into communities and making projects that are really embedded and that take quite a long time to develop, which I think. And then there's this image is from the Visible Fictions show White, which is one of the more famous examples of early years shows that was developed in Scotland. This is a really beautiful piece of theatre. It's for 3 to 5-year-olds, and it features these two men, you can see here, who live inside this kind of white world, which is you can see here also. And what they do, or what they seem to do, is look after eggs. That's what they do. So they look after them and they keep them warm, they polish them, and this is what they do. But then one night a red egg appears, and one of these men really freaks out and puts it in the bin because he doesn't really want it, because it's and then the other man gets up in the middle of the night and rescues it and decides that he's going to look after the red egg as well. And then the whole piece ends with a sort of explosion of colour on the stage with kind of, so it's really just a piece about sort of the accommodation of difference, really, and about how it might be quite scary if you encounter things that are slightly different, but if you can bring them into your world, then it makes your world richer and more colourful. So it's really beautiful piece of theatre, really, and I think that's toured in various iterations and won awards.
Yeah.
So
No,
again, I mean, the other thing to say about that is that the Scottish Government did or has established a programme, a schools programme, where it will fund a production to go into every school at least once a year. So this means that, I mean, it's not a perfect scheme by any stretch of the imagination, but it does mean, I think, that what's happened in Scotland is that there is actually a viable living to be made if you're a practitioner who wants to work with for children or young audiences. There is an actual living to be made. You can make work, and it's got places, it's got places to go. So yeah. So that, I think that's a really, and then also some of the more established Scottish playwrights in recent decades have also done a fair amount of work for young audiences. So David Gregg is a good example. David Gregg has written a couple of really beautiful plays for teenagers. So yeah.
Can I ask, in the book, you say you're talking about scholarship, and you're saying at a certain point the term political theatre seemed to become unpopular and people moved away from it and it was almost dropped, but that you were turning to it, or you wanted to take another look at the term of political theatre and what it meant. What brought you to that conversation in terms of Scottish theatre and what you were looking at? Or where did this...
Yeah, I mean, I think in the 90s, like, I'm sort of aware that in the 90s, certainly, there was this kind of a lot of accounts of British theatre, and that if you want to use that term, in the 1990s really focuses, well, many accounts of playwriting in this main island, like, really just focus on London. I mean, that's one thing that's been, I've written a bit about that as well, that there is this kind of metropolitan bias around, like this idea that anything interesting that ever happened in London. So you can get whole volumes. Like, I think the last Cambridge Companion to British Theatre, which I'm looking at my shelf, doesn't have a chapter on Wales in it. So it maybe you would get, it doesn't make, I mean, I know this is contentious because a lot of Northern Irish playwrights obviously see themselves as Irish, but it doesn't mention Northern Ireland. So it's kind of so there are these kind of tensions that are that are kind of interesting. So I think I was kind of conscious that in the 90s there's sort of, I mean, we've all seen this, I think, as well. I mean, somebody like Martin McDonagh would be included in this, certainly in the plays that he did in the 90s, that those plays that were gathered under the heading In Your Face by Alex Sears in his very influential book. And I know that Alex has been very careful and to repeatedly stress that he wasn't saying that that this was a movement or that this was the whole of theatre, but it's kind of received like that. But it's interesting, I think, from my perspective, that in Scotland that wasn't really what was happening, really. So there's kind of interviews around, say, David Gregg's probably his most successful early play is a play called Europe, which is still in the repertoire. And it's a brilliant play, actually. It's difficult to believe he wrote it when he was like 24 or 25. It's quite shocking. But when asked in an interview around that time, like 1994, if he would describe himself as a political playwright, David said yes.
Okay.
So that which was and I think that the movement, or the feeling, or certainly in Alex's account of what was going on in London, it's to do with this kind of like a sort of a retreat from direct politics, a sort of a kind of and a move towards the kind of more experiential and the more kind of effective strategies, and a move away from it, and kind of various types of shock tactics, if you want to describe them in those ways. So, but Scotland has had a very strong tradition, particularly in the West and Glasgow, of political playwriting, of working class political playwriting. And I think that it has been sustained to some...
I suppose in places like Scotland, and again, I'm thinking of Ireland and the north of Ireland, it's very hard to feel removed from political theatre when the question of national identity is always under protest, or is always being contested, and is just incredibly loaded. And
in the period covered by this book, like the constitutional question is the key question, and it just kind of keeps coming back to it, really, this question of them.
And is it still, like, it still seems incredibly unresolved, because there was the referendum, but then there was Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I don't really know. I don't really know what's going to happen in the next Holyrood election, but it looks as if the SNP might make some recovery, like make gains for the Holyrood election. But it's interesting because although the fortunes of the SNP, I mean, the SNP is not the independence movement, and that's one thing to stress. There are other groups and other people who have been involved in that. But I think the polling in terms of like support for indie hasn't really shifted with like the some fall in the SNP's fortunes at the last Westminster election. It doesn't shift the polls for or against indie. So I think it is unresolved. I think that's right. I think it is an unresolved question. And the demographics are such that, younger people tend to be far more in support of it. And the arts community in generally was very much in, whether that is also an experience that, that was much earlier was kind of the case in Ireland. It almost seems as if, I mean, and this might sound like it probably is a horrible kind of reduction way of thinking about it, but it almost seems as if like because the arts community are like their job is to imagine things and like to imagine how things would be different. Like they seemed much more, so the voices against indie in the arts community were very few, and they were quite like yeah, whereas mostly it seemed as if the arts community were all in favour of it, really, let's make a new country, it'll be great.
Restore it.
But I think I think that thing of like of Brexit is a real blow to those ambitions, because a hard border between Scotland and England is unthinkable. It just wouldn't work.
Okay. We have a question here from Trisha O'Byrne. Do you want to pop in there, Trish?
Hi guys. Thanks a million, Trish. This is great.
Hello.
I was just going to ask you about international touring. Do you think there's a bit of a drop or a kind of a less inclination to tour internationally and maybe do more kind of work for people in Scotland? I mean, I heard that I just been talking to a Scottish theatre maker that sort of came up. I was just wondering what you thought.
I mean, I think that might be the case in the more recent, like when Jackie Wiley's been the artistic director of the National Theatre of Scotland. Jackie's background is it's really interesting because she's not a director. She's a producer, and she had very strong history in live art and experimental art. So she was like the AD at the Arches for a long time, when a lot of the stuff around the National Review of Live Art and all that kind of stuff was happening. Really. But I think that there will always be some pressure on the national companies. I mean, the other thing, Tricia, is that the national companies in Scotland, the National Theatre of Scotland, Scottish Opera, Scottish Ballet, and the two major orchestras are centrally funded by the Scottish Government. So they are not subject, like everybody else in the theatre and performance community, to the sort of like, fickle behaviours of Creative Scotland. They don't have to apply for their funding, but also it's in the constitution of the National Theatre of Scotland that it is the flagship company, and that part of its job is to represent Scotland, not just on national but on international stages. So I'd be surprised if they don't tour some things internationally. What is interesting, I think, is to think more carefully about like what they choose to tour and what they don't choose to tour. So they do choose to tour these things. My view is that they have chosen to tour these things that sort of, as I say, hit that kind of the sort of iconography of Scotland, the recognisable iconography of Scotland outside the UK. And they have tended to tour a lot to the diaspora. Okay. So they tour a lot to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to places where we know there are a lot of people who would identify as Scottish or as having Scottish,
ancestry.
Yeah. So I think so things like Black Watch, but also the image that I showed of Matthew, my pigeon, and this is a touring. This is from Toronto, I think, a touring production of Rona Munro's The James Plays. So again, it's got swords. It's got like it's got Let's Fight the English. It's got all that in it. Those dastardly perfidious Albion. It's got all that in it. Yeah.
Yeah. We have another question there from Barry. I might just see, can we bring him in? because I know we're ticking by.
Sure. Thanks, Trish and Miriam. Trish, just curious about festivals in Scotland, and obviously Edinburgh is such this
Yes.
huge machine.
Mhm.
How sustainable is it? I mean, is it still the be all and end all for artists, or what's the alternative then outside of Edinburgh throughout the year? What are the other festivals that matter to artists?
I mean, I think I mean, for live artists and so on, and for like developing that kind of work, then certainly Take Me Somewhere in Glasgow is quite a good, is still kind of quite a good stage for international like live and performance art. The Tramway isn't the powerhouse that it once was in terms of being I don't think being a venue for international sort of touring festival work. I mean, when it was first established in the late 80s as a performance venue with the Mahabharata, in the 10 years or maybe longer after that, it was a real place where you could see, the Worcester Group and Lepage and all that. And lots of theatre makers of that generation, like who emerged, who during that generation. So I'm thinking, for example, of John Tiffany, who directed Black Watch and who's obviously now very famous and successful Tony Award winning director. John Tiffany talks about being a student at the University of Glasgow. He was a physics student, I believe, actually, and going to the Tramway and seeing all these mad, like huge, big international shows. And that was a real inspiration to him in terms of like the way he developed, his thinking around like the kind of scale of his work or what kind of work he might make. So I think that, and then during that period as well, Glasgow had its own festival in May, which was called Mayfest. But the Edinburgh Festival is too big, and there's a renewed focus on how like exploitative it is in terms of artists and particularly the fringe, and also how people are priced out of it, or how you can't get a room for like 500 quid and all that kind of stuff. So but it is more, I mean, it's often thought about in terms of it's not just theatre. I mean, the fringe is substantially comedy. So people would tend to talk about the Edinburgh festivals rather than the festival. The Edinburgh International Festival is only quite a small part of what's going on in August in Edinburgh. It's the biggest arts festival in the world. And it also has the film festival and the book festival and the fringe, But certainly, I think it does kind of distorts the. I mean, the Traverse was really founded in the 1960s by a group of people who wanted to extend this was their view, was that like Edinburgh in the 1950s was kind of like still quite a dour, Calvinist place for most of the year. It was grey and dark, and it was all cover your ankles, morag, you shameless bitch. It was that kind of thing. But then, and for 3 weeks in the summer, it all went a bit mental, and like whole sorts of like interesting people came, and everyone so there was a group of sort of like sort of interested people in Edinburgh, not all of whom were born in Scotland, but who decided that they wanted to extend that kind of vibe, like beyond that month, really. And that's really why the Traverse was founded in 1963 as a kind of theatre club that would host these kind of like the kind of performances that people in Edinburgh could only ever get access to during the festival. And that's why it became a kind of like, and that became their project really to sort of to extend it for the whole year. Yeah.
Thanks.
Not sure that answers your question, Barry. But
does anyone else want to raise a hand? Or I might push in. I have one other question. Oh, you keep going actually, Trish, before I.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that, like, I do think that, like, one thing I would say in my last chapter when I talk about, which I think is also kind of important, certainly it's important from my perspective, is to talk about, like, some of these kind of new imperatives that have come to bear on Scottish theatre in the last decade or so, really. And some of these are around the kind of same imperatives that have affected the industry, like across the developed world, really. So I'm thinking of like Me Too, particularly, and also Black Lives Matter. So this is a piece called A Lament for Sheiko Bayo, who's a young black man who was killed by police in Kirkcaldy in Fife about 10 years ago, I think now, and that it really tells the story of the in ways that echo quite disturbingly the many cases in London of a family trying to get justice for their son or partner or father, and the difficulties that they encounter around sort of a structural disadvantage. So one of the things I think is really interesting is that Scotland has had a tendency in certain strands of its cultural production to sort of stress its egalitarian history. It's the sense of that we're the sense of difference between Scotland and England, the sense of difference politically, that Scotland's more progressive. It's one of the arguments that underwrites the kind of indie movement, that we could be a more progressive, more left of centre, more like a little Northern European country. If only we could get rid of these people who are holding us back, really. But I think the evidence, in a lot of ways, the hard evidence doesn't really support some of those narratives. So the idea that Scotland is a less racist country in England, it's not supported in evidence. And also the idea that Scotland is more egalitarian, it's supported in evidence in some ways in relation to maybe voting patterns, but it's not supported in relation to the actual lived experience of some of the people of Scotland. I mean, the city that I grew up in Glasgow, in the East End of Glasgow, has got some of the most hideous and ingrained and generational poverty of anywhere in the UK. And, decades of voting for a Labour council didn't shift that. So I think it is kind of like, one of those I think it's really important for commentators on Scottish culture just to kind of like remind Scotland,
Yeah.
not to get not to get too pleased with itself, really.
My question was going to be
yeah.
around sort of the impact in the last few years of Me Too and Waking the Feminists and Black Lives Matter, and did Scotland sort of need that shake up the way perhaps some other cultures and programs did, where there might have been just an automatic insane bias towards certain identities or voices?
I mean, I think that there have been some, well, yes, I mean, I think there is a report, and I think I mentioned it in my book. There's a report that was done not long ago by Christine Hamilton and somebody else, I can't remember now the name, but the representation for women in Scottish theatre has vastly improved.
Yeah.
Like
And
really
because
vastly.
of the scheme, or just general educational trend?
Yeah, in terms of like the numbers of women who are like in positions of creative leadership, the number of companies in Scotland that are run by women, the numbers of designers or I mean, it's not perfectly 50-50, but it's much better than it is in England. I write about this in my a chapter that I did recently for the new Bloomsbury. There's a handbook of women in British theatre. So I think I've written about that in that. So they have done a lot of work to try and obviously, like, the company's had three, the National Theatre of Scotland has had 3 artistic directors and 2 of them have been women. So there has been quite a lot of leadership by women. But you still would get a bias, difficulties around playwriting, so equal representation on main stages for women playwrights for sure. So I think that's
Maybe
right.
that has been somewhat positive in
Yeah,
comparison.
no, it has been positive, and there have been like concerted efforts made to improve it, really.
I remember in our run-up to the 2018 referendum here for Repeal the Eighth, which prevented abortions in Ireland. So Irish women always had to travel. And usually they, historically it was the boat to Liverpool or the boat to London. And then, of course, the Ryanair flights. And it was your Prime Minister at the time, her name is
Nicola Sturgeon.
Did a really sort of public outreach and said, women in Ireland will always be welcome to come to Scotland to use the clinics, and trying to put some financial support or some full support behind that. And I remember being blown away. I think the signal it sends, a sort of a transnational feminist solidarity. It was.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, she was always very, like, really strong in that space, and she was always really strong at a thing that think is really fantastic, is she's very strong on the issues of trans rights as well, of people having a right to bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
And that, you know, I mean, what you're talking about, the principle that underwrites a women's reproductive freedoms, which are absolutely
Essential to
non-negotiable, should be non-negotiable to any civilized human being. Because the alternative to that is The Handmaid's Tale. That's the alternative. And she extended that to include, like, you know, trans people, to say people have got a right to bodily autonomy. If you believe in women's reproductive rights, then how can you, on what basis do you argue for that? You argue for that on the ground that women have got a right to bodily autonomy. You can't just say that we've got a right to bodily autonomy, but that person over there doesn't have a right to bodily autonomy. Like, it is either it is or it isn't. So she's very strong, and I think she'd won a number of awards for that, around, like, she just held the line about those issues in a way that was really great, actually. So I think that's right. And they do have legislation now, I mean, I think they might have it in England now as well, of those kind of like zones where they also keep the loonies away from these clinics so that they can't, like, really actually harass people who are going about their lawful business. They're just like, okay, if you want to harass people, you can go away. And so J.D. Vance mentioned it in his speech about the values of Europe recently, about in Scotland, how in Scotland apparently somebody had been arrested for praying. Well, obviously that's not true. That's not why the person was arrested. It was because they repeatedly ignored the law, which is that you have to stay back, and they just repeatedly ignored it. That's why they were arrested. But I think, I think that's right. So I mean, I think it's one of those interesting, it's a really interesting aspect of the culture, is that there are these, for sure, there are progressive forces that are really progressive forces, and then there are less progressive forces, and it's a bit of a
And that's coming through the storytelling then.
Yeah, always coming through the storytelling. I think always coming through the storytelling. Yeah.
I don't know, is there a final question or two out there? Because there's one here from Dominic.
Dominic,
want to hop in? I know we can't keep you forever.
Yes, hi.
Yes.
Hi, Trish, that's great, thank you. I was just wondering, I suppose maybe if it's a final question, it's quite general as well. Because maybe, as you've written a book which is kind of quite big in scope, I was wondering if maybe you treat this in the book, if you try to maybe define or identify elements that a Scottish theatre which make it particularly Scottish, and distinct from other British theatre and other Anglophone theatre. Because you talked a bit about the popular sentiment and the popular kind of published sort of theatre in Scotland. And I wonder if I've seen people, kind of other academics, talk about Scottish theatre in that kind of way as well. I wondered, is that an element of Scottish theatre which is particularly Scottish?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think certainly in that playwriting space, I think it is an element now. It's become a kind of like signature, if you like, of like that. So that kind of popular political playwriting is a strong tradition of that, which kind of continues and still continues to be made by the National Theatre and continues to be staged in some of the more, so more recently you might see a production that was made, like Gary McNair, who's a really interesting young Scottish theatre maker, made a great piece. I don't know if you saw, if you've encountered this, Miriam, it's a few years ago, it's called Locker Room Talk, where he made this piece where he went and collected verbatim comments from the locker room, like from guys, like in the football or whatever locker room. But then he made the piece was staged at the Traverse, I think, but all the dialogue was read by women, by young female actors, which is a great, really extraordinary piece. But he also made a piece much more recently that was commissioned, I think, by the National Theatre of Scotland, which is called Dear Billy, where he spent time travelling around the country, collecting anecdotes and stories about Billy Connolly and about people's relationship to Billy Connolly. And then he made this show about like Billy Connolly, and it was great success and everybody loved it. But that was staged like by the National Theatre of Scotland at the Pavilion in Glasgow, which is one of the big commercial, receiving houses. So I think the National Theatre has tried to cross that boundary a bit as well, so that it's the kind of theatre where you would get, I'm trying to think who would, Daniel O'Donnell would kind of perform there, these kind of things. And then yeah, and then sort of doing, so they have made that effort to do that, yeah. So I think that kind of popular political, more directly political, kind of popular and populist maybe is a signature, but it's quite a varied. One of the things I've tried to capture in the book is that there is a real diversity of practice, and Scotland isn't Glasgow and it isn't Edinburgh and it isn't, there's lots of different things going on, yeah, in different places. Yeah.
Thanks, Trish. Luke just put in the comments there for everyone. Locker Room Talk was produced at the Abbey in Dublin in 2017. So
Oh, what was that like?
I didn't see it, but Luke, did you see it?
Yeah, sorry. It was performed by an Irish cast, so as you described, but it was very timely, and it was also part of a mini kind of documentary verbatim festival called What's Happening Now. But yeah, it worked really well. I mean, misogyny is misogyny, so it translated quite naturally across.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that David Gregg said, I remember. I remember Vicky Featherstone said a thing that was a presentation that she gave years ago, and she talked about when she first took the job at the National Theatre of Scotland, and David Gregg was appointed as the National Theatre of Scotland's first dramaturg. And she said that one of the things that David said to her early on is like, what you need to understand, Vicky, is that the National Playwright of Scotland is not Shakespeare. The National Playwright of Scotland is Brecht. So that thing of like, and I think like what Gary does in that piece is a kind of classic, like, Verfremdungs effect, isn't it?
Yeah. So
that and I think that kind of, that sort of that kind of approach does kind of retain its I don't know if you know, there's a play by a Scottish playwright called Kieran Hurley, who's obviously Irish, also by partly by descent, but Kieran wrote a really good play piece, I think 2018 or maybe 17, called Mouthpiece, and that was done at the Traverse in Edinburgh. It came to London as well, in which it's a two-hander, and it's about this playwright who's struggling to kind of to revive her career in Edinburgh, and then she goes out one night onto the crags, above the city, and she meets this lad who's called Declan, and he's like 17, and he's from one of these like really deprived peripheral housing estates, and she gets friendly with him, and then eventually she writes a play about his experiences in its stage at the Traverse, and it really revives her career. So, but then at the end of this play, he sort of breaks into the theatre. Like, he can't afford the tickets, but he breaks in, and then he kind of like, he also sort of breaks the whole realist convention by sort of insisting that he will not perform the ending that she has written for him, because she writes this ending in which he like despairs completely about his future and throws himself off the crags or whatever. I can't remember if that's the exact thing, but he just refuses to kill himself. He just refuses to do it. So there's this kind of thing of, just again, I think that's part of that tradition of like just sort of yeah, I don't know if I'm making myself very clear, but that is a really good little play. Yeah, it's a really good little play. Yeah.
Thanks, Trish.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, or if anyone else wants to pop in, just raise a hand. But assuming we're on the way to wrapping up, can we hear a little bit about this music career that you once had? Because I've seen these pictures of very interesting hairstyles that I
oh, well, we were young, Miriam, so
well,
yeah, I mean, this is just a thing, this is totally unrelated to this book really, but I when I was young, it's true, when I was a young person, I was quite heavily involved in the music scene in Glasgow. So some people have made a documentary about it's called Since Yesterday, which is the name of a Strawberry Switchblade that anybody in the call who's old enough might remember, this girl band from Glasgow in the 80s called Strawberry Switchblade. And if you've got a VPN or you're in the UK, it's on the iPlayer actually, because it was partly funded by BBC Scotland. But it tells the history of the story of the history of girl bands in Scotland, and a couple of the bands that I was involved in the 1980s are featured in it quite heavily. So it's been quite an odd time, really. We've all been dragged back into our past.
So were you a singer?
I sang backing vocals, I played the guitar, and I wrote songs as a songwriter.
You know what my next question's going to be?
Eh?
Any chance you could sing us out?
Oh no, at this
No?
point, no.
Does
You
it
know,
have
if
to?
it comes to Dublin though, I would really recommend the new Ship Theatre show, which
Okay.
is called What's Left of Us. I don't know if you've encountered that company. It's two youngish women, and they're sort of darlings of the fringe in this country, but they've made this brilliant piece which is about, it's really brilliant piece. It's partly about grief and it's also about folk music. And that ends with a sing around, but it also ends with a really beautiful rendition of The Parting Glass, which, and you, as you will all know, is a Scottish song, but which has been much more widely sung in Ireland. There's the Song of Parting. So yes, it's
All
a
right.
really great show. It might come to one of the festivals. It's really brilliant. It's very moving, really beautifully
Keep an
done.
eye out for it. And if you see it being advertised, would you send us on
I
a
will,
message
yeah.
and
Go
we'll
see.
circulate it?
It's great. Yeah, it's really, really great. But yeah, I mean, you can go on YouTube, and the bands I were in, the first band I was in was called Sophisticated Boom Boom, after a Shangri-La song of the same name. And the second band was called His Latest Flame. And after the Elvis song, and you can find video evidence on YouTube of my misspent youth. I recommend it to everyone.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I know what
I
I'm
had a
doing.
very extended adolescence. It was great, and I don't regret it.
Why would you?
Why would
Trish, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for
that was-
inviting me. It's been delightful. Thank you very
It's
much.
lovely just to chat
Yeah.
about theatre and get the sort of overview
Mhm.
of Scotland. I know we don't have time to go into the bits and
Yeah.
pieces. I have Trish's book here, which I'm sure you all have as well. It's beautifully written. It's been really insightful. I'm learning so much going through it. And thank you for taking on such a task, because I think it is framing and reframing a lot of what's come out of Scotland and a lot of the issues that are in Scotland and a lot of the things that are happening there, and how sort of they're Scotland specific, but they're also European specific. They're also 21st century specific. And there's just incredibly important questions there about story and nation and community that I think you've really captured. So thank you for doing that and sharing your time and your thoughts with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Trish.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great. Thank you.
Oh, that's lovely. And to everyone who's here, thank you for joining us as well. We're going to stop the recording now, and hopefully we'll see you all soon at some conference or another, and we can sort of have a toast and raise a glass to the new book.